Before you hear my story, take a breath. Imagine discovering that the man you built your life around, the one you trusted more than yourself, has been living another life behind your back. Imagine his suitcase packed with lies, his smile rehearsed, his love borrowed. And now picture this. The moment you finally decide to stop crying and start watching. The moment you install a hidden camera, press play, and see the truth unfold in front of your eyes. What you're about to hear isn't revenge. It's what happens when a quiet woman chooses to stop being quiet. It was supposed to be just another business trip. He packed his usual navy suit, the same cologne he always wore, the one that lingered on the pillows long after he left. He kissed my forehead before closing the door and said, "Don't wait up. It's going to be a long weekend." I smiled, pretending not to feel the distance that had been growing between us for months. But deep down, something was off. His eyes didn't hold mine the same way. His touch felt practiced, not loving. 3 nights later, I was sitting in the dark with only the flickering glow of the television. My hands were trembling as I opened the laptop. The feed from the hidden camera I had placed inside his luggage connected instantly. My heart hammered against my ribs as static filled the screen, then adjusted to a hotel room bathed in golden light. And there he was, my husband, laughing, relaxed, more alive than I'd seen him in years. Only he wasn't alone. She entered the frame wearing a red dress that shimmered under the chandelier. I recognized her instantly, the woman from the office party last spring, the one who had complimented my shoes while her eyes never left him. My stomach turned. She poured wine into his glass and leaned close, her hand brushing his tie as if she'd done it 1,000 times before. He smiled. That same smile he used to give me when we were newly married. It hit me then that I was watching the ghost of my own love story, replayed with a different actress. I should have looked away, should have turned it off. But pain has its own gravity. I watched them dance. I watched him whisper something in her ear that made her laugh. The sound came through the tiny microphone I had hidden between the suitcase lining. I had thought I wanted the truth, but the truth felt like acid burning through everything I had built. I sat frozen for hours, tears streaming silently down my face, until the screen went black. The camera battery had died. In that darkness, a new kind of light appeared in me. Cold, sharp, deliberate. It wasn't the light of forgiveness. It was the light of clarity. The next morning, I started to plan. I replayed every conversation we'd had in the last month, every meeting, every late night at the office. I stopped crying. Instead, I began collecting. Proof, timing, access. I realized that pain could be power if you learned to hold it without letting it burn you alive. Then, 1 week later, I heard the news. She was throwing herself a birthday party, a private celebration at the same hotel. My husband was on the guest list. They thought no one knew. That's when I decided. If betrayal had to be witnessed, it would be witnessed properly. I called a friend who worked in events, arranged for a small, technical surprise, and asked her to let me handle the projection setup for the evening. It took me 2 days to modify the camera footage, to cut the moments that mattered, to make sure every laugh, every kiss, every deceit would play loud and clear before their guests. When the night came, I dressed in black, not out of mourning, but out of precision. I arrived early, blending in among the staff, my heart beating in sync with the bass thudding from the ballroom. The screens were ready, the system primed, the footage cued. As the lights dimmed and the guests clapped for the birthday girl, I stood by the projector. My hands didn't shake this time. I whispered to myself, "You took my trust. Now I'll take your illusion." And when I pressed play, their laughter froze. Before the betrayal had a face or a date, it had small beginnings, moments so ordinary that I didn't see them for what they were. We met in 2008, in the kind of place where dreams still feel possible. A university party, cheap wine, and a rooftop view that made promises sound real. He had that kind of charm that filled silence, that way of looking at you as if nothing else existed. I fell fast, the way people do when they think they're being chosen. We married 2 years later. It wasn't grand, just a simple ceremony in a garden behind his mother's house. I wore a borrowed dress and carried white roses. He cried during the vows. I thought that meant something. I remember thinking, this is the man I'll grow old with. We built our first apartment together. Chipped tiles, mismatched furniture, and endless plans. We didn't have much, but every corner of that home smelled like laughter and possibility. For a long time, he was good. Or maybe I was too blind to see otherwise. He worked long hours, kissed me on the forehead before leaving, sent messages in the middle of the day that said, "Miss you already." We saved for vacations we rarely took, and when we finally traveled, he always took photos of me, thousands of them. I used to think that's how love was proven, in photographs. I didn't realize he was building an archive of my devotion, not of his. The first crack came quietly, in 2015. He started coming home later, smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't mine. He'd laugh it off. "It's from the office, honey. Everyone hugs each other there." I wanted to believe him, and I did, because believing hurt less than doubting. Love, when it's deep, becomes a kind of blindness you defend as loyalty. By 2017, the small lies had grown teeth. I found receipts for dinners I hadn't been to, shirts I hadn't bought, and one day, a hotel charge that he swore was a client event. We fought. I cried. He held me, apologized, swore it would never happen again. He looked me in the eyes with that same softness that first made me love him, and I let him win. Because forgiveness is addictive when you're afraid of being alone. Then came 2020, the year the world stopped. Quarantine was supposed to bring people closer, but it only showed how far apart we already were. He worked from the guest room with the door closed, his voice low on calls that ended the second I walked by. We ate dinner in silence. He smiled less. I laughed less. Every day the distance grew, like fog filling a valley until you can't see where it started. I began to shrink myself to fit his moods, cooking his favorite meals, pretending not to notice when he avoided my touch. My reflection in the mirror looked smaller too, like a version of me that had faded under the weight of trying too hard. He'd say, "You're imagining things," whenever I asked questions. And I believed him, again. Because hope is a cruel thing. It makes you rewrite reality just to delay heartbreak. In 2021, he started going on more business trips. I used to pack his bag for him, tucking small notes inside that said, "Come back safe, I love you." He used to send pictures from airports, smiling, coffee in hand. But over time, the photos stopped showing his face. Just hotel lobbies, dinners, vague cityscapes. Once he sent me a photo of a sunset over the ocean. I later found out it was the same view from the city she lived in. By early 2022, I was living with a stranger who slept beside me. I could feel his absence even in his presence. His phone, once left casually on the counter, now followed him everywhere like a heartbeat. The password changed. The warmth changed. Everything changed. And yet, I stayed. Not because I was weak, but because I was loyal to the version of him I had built in my mind. The man from 2008. The one who cried during our vows. I didn't realize that love, when it's unreciprocated, becomes a kind of quiet self-destruction. Then one night, he forgot his briefcase at home. It was open on the table. Inside, a perfume sample, feminine, floral, familiar. And beneath it, a receipt from a boutique hotel. The date matched the night he told me he was stuck in traffic. I didn't scream. I didn't confront him. I just sat there, the paper trembling in my hands, and whispered to myself, "Now I know." It started as background noise, whispers that seemed harmless, coincidences that could be explained away. He'd receive calls and step out onto the balcony, his voice low, the conversation short but laced with a tone that didn't belong to work. When I asked who it was, he smiled that practiced smile that never reached his eyes and said, "Just a client." I believed him the first few times. Then I began to notice how every client seemed to call after midnight. The red flags didn't arrive all at once. They came disguised as ordinary life, a change in cologne, a new playlist full of songs he used to hate, a sudden obsession with the gym. He started shaving on weekends again, wearing shirts that still had store creases. I used to think it meant he was trying for me. I didn't realize he was rehearsing for someone else. There were new patterns, too. He'd linger in the car after coming home, engine running, light from his phone illuminating his face. I'd watch from the window, pretending not to notice. Some nights he'd come in smelling like perfume, his excuse as predictable as the moon. The elevator was crowded. At dinner, his attention lived elsewhere. He scrolled while I spoke, laughed at messages I couldn't see, and when I asked what was so funny, he'd say, "You wouldn't get it." I tried to keep the peace. I told myself all marriages have dry seasons, that maybe he was stressed, maybe I was overreacting. I even convinced myself that if I loved him enough, he'd find his way back to me. But love doesn't fix betrayal. It only delays its discovery. Then came the whispers from outside the house, the kind that travel faster than truth. A friend from my yoga class mentioned seeing him near the marina on a Saturday morning. "With someone," she said, her tone careful, her eyes apologetic. I laughed it off, but the laughter felt sharp in my throat. Another friend sent me a picture by mistake. A group shot from a company event. He was in it, smiling beside that same woman in the red dress. Her hand rested lightly on his shoulder. My stomach turned, but I said nothing. Silence had become my survival. Soon after, the lies began to contradict each other. One night, he said he was traveling to Chicago. The next day, his credit card alert showed a restaurant charge in our own city. When I confronted him, he shrugged and said, "Flight got canceled. Stayed with a colleague." His tone was calm, too calm, the kind that comes from rehearsed deceit. I started counting the inconsistencies like beads on a rosary. Every lie a prayer for clarity. The car smelled different each time he came home. His phone never left his pocket, even when he showered. Once, I caught him deleting messages before handing me his phone to prove there was nothing to hide. He thought I didn't notice the brief flicker of panic in his eyes when I reached for it. One night, while folding laundry, I found a strand of long blonde hair on the inside of his jacket collar. I held it between my fingers like evidence, like truth whispering through silence. It wasn't mine. It wasn't from any of our friends. My hands shook so badly I had to sit down. That night, I couldn't sleep. I watched him breathing beside me, peaceful, unaware that I was quietly mourning the man I used to know. The next morning, I started saving everything: receipts, text messages, even the lies. I began writing them down, like a diary of deceit. I wasn't ready to confront him yet, but I was done pretending not to see. Every detail mattered now. Every whisper became a clue. I began planning, not out of revenge, but out of a desperate need for truth. I told myself that if I was going to fall apart, I would at least fall apart with proof. The night I decided to install the camera, the house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator. He had fallen asleep on the couch, still dressed, his phone clutched loosely in his hand. The television played an infomercial that no one was watching. I sat across from him, studying his face in the pale blue glow. The same face I'd once traced with my fingers under the moonlight, the same lips that had sworn forever. I realized then that forever had an expiration date, and I was staring right at it. I moved quietly, like someone committing a sacred act. In a way, it was. I wasn't trying to destroy him. I just needed to see the truth with my own eyes. I had spent months doubting myself, gaslighting myself into silence. Every instinct I'd buried came back in waves, urging me to stop asking why and start finding how. The idea came from a documentary I'd seen months earlier about investigative journalists hiding cameras in objects. I didn't own fancy equipment, just curiosity and desperation. I spent the next day researching how to modify a small motion-activated camera. It was barely the size of a button, but it recorded in full color and sound. I ordered it online under a false name, shipped to my friend's address. When the package arrived, it was small enough to fit in my palm, a black square that hummed quietly when powered on. It was the sound of my resolve. I chose his travel bag because it was sacred to him. Never touched, always packed by his own hands. I knew every pocket, every zipper, every hidden compartment. It was the perfect hiding place. I waited until Friday, the the night before another conference, when he left the bag open after checking his suit. My hands were steady, almost unnaturally calm, as I stitched the tiny camera into the fabric lining behind a flap. The lens was invisible unless you knew where to look. It faced the perfect angle: the bed, the door, the window. It felt wrong, intrusive, but betrayal changes your moral compass. When someone steals your trust, you stop caring about the rules that once made you kind. That night, as he slept, I whispered into the dark, "You taught me this silence. Now I'll let it speak." When he left in the morning, he kissed my cheek. His lips brushed my skin like the touch of a stranger. I smiled and said, "Have a safe trip." My voice didn't shake. Inside my heart was a war drum. I watched him drive away, then opened my laptop. The signal blinked green. Connected. The first few hours were uneventful. Just a hotel lobby, a suitcase dropped carelessly on the floor, his jacket hanging by the window. I watched from my kitchen, coffee in hand, pretending it was a normal morning. The ache in my chest was constant, dull, like a wound healing too slowly. But as night fell, the feed changed. He entered the frame wearing that same navy suit I had pressed the night before. He looked happy, lighter. He poured himself a drink, adjusted his tie, and glanced at the door. A knock followed. My pulse quickened. When she walked in, I knew without question. The woman from the company event, the one with perfect hair and a voice like sugar dissolving in poison. She hugged him from behind, her hands already familiar with his body. I watched through the small screen as my husband became someone else, a man free of guilt, of marriage, of me. I should have screamed, should have thrown the laptop across the room. Instead, I took a deep breath and whispered, "Thank you," because pain without proof is madness, and proof was finally mine. Over the next 2 weeks, I recorded everything. Their dinners, their mornings, the stolen hours they spent laughing while I ironed his shirts at home. The camera caught every whisper, every touch. And as I watched, I began to notice the details that hurt most. How easily he lied. How effortlessly he lived 2 lives. One night, as I sat rewatching the footage, an idea formed, sharp and dangerous. She was planning her birthday party, a grand event she had posted about online. He would be there. Everyone would be there. And so would I. Not in person, but in every image, every projection, every heartbeat of the truth I was about to show. That's when revenge stopped being fantasy and became choreography. The night of her party arrived wrapped in glitter and deceit. It was one of those evenings that smelled like champagne and arrogance, where people dressed their lies in silk and laughter. I knew every detail before I even stepped near the hotel. The guest list, the catering schedule, the playlist. She had posted most of it online, desperate to be adored, to be seen. What she didn't know was that she had invited me too, not with a card, but with her carelessness. I dressed in black. Not morning black, hunter black. My hair pulled back, my face calm, my purpose clear. I didn't go as a guest. I went as a ghost of truth. The lobby was full of flowers and mirrors. Everything glittered too much. People smiled with mouths that didn't reach their eyes, toasting to love that wasn't real. I walked past them unnoticed, carrying nothing but a small laptop and a flash drive. My silent weapon. The ballroom pulsed with music. Lights flickered across golden walls. I stood near the corner, where the projector equipment had been set up by the event staff earlier that day. A friend I trusted, one who owed me more than a favor, had arranged the simplest switch, a single click to replace their slideshow of memories with my film of betrayal. They thought the projection would display her photos, the ones with friends and family, the moments she wanted the world to see. It would, but it would also show what she hid. I moved like I belonged there, blending into the rhythm of the night. My pulse was steady, unnaturally so. Across the room, he stood beside her, my husband, the man I had loved for 14 years. He looked younger somehow, lighter. His arm rested on her waist, his smile effortless, as though the weight of our marriage had never existed. I watched him from the crowd, remembering every time I'd waited at home with dinner growing cold, every unanswered message, every lie disguised as love. At one point, his eyes swept across the room and caught mine. Or maybe they just passed through me, because there was no flicker of recognition. I was invisible to him now. A stranger he once promised forever to. My stomach tightened, but I didn't move. I didn't blink. I wanted him to see what he'd created, to face the version of himself that lived in my recordings. When the host called for everyone's attention, the chatter softened to a hum. The lights dimmed. A microphone cracked to life. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer said. "Before the cake, a short video. A little surprise from someone special." I stepped back, unseen, near the control booth. My finger hovered over the space bar. The air felt electric, thick with champagne and anticipation. He held her hand. She laughed, radiant in her red dress, the same color she had worn the first night I saw them together. My chest burned, but I stayed still. Then I pressed play. At first, the crowd cheered. The screen filled with soft music and images of her, smiling, posing, waving at the camera. But within seconds, the footage shifted. The lighting changed. The hotel room appeared. And there they were, my husband and her, laughing, kissing, tangled in sheets that weren't theirs to share. The sound caught up half a second later, his voice whispering something into her ear, something so intimate the room collectively froze. Gasps cut through the air like glass shattering. The music died. The screen kept rolling. Some people looked away. Others couldn't. She stood there motionless, her painted smile dissolving, her hands trembling. My husband's face drained of color. He whispered her name once, twice, before bolting toward the projector. But it was too late. Everyone had seen. I stepped forward, just enough for him to see me across the chaos. Calm, steady, unflinching. Our eyes met, and for the first time in years, I saw fear in his. Not guilt. Fear. Because he finally understood that I wasn't the quiet woman who believed his stories anymore. I was the witness, the proof, the storm he had built with his own hands. Security rushed in. Guests whispered. Cameras flashed. And in the midst of the noise, she covered her face and ran toward the exit, heels slipping on the marble floor. He chased her, calling her name. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. The world had seen what I needed it to see. I left through the service door, unnoticed, the way I'd come. Outside, the air was cold, the night silent except for the distant hum of traffic. I took a deep breath and whispered to myself, this was never revenge. This was truth returning home. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. The video still played as I stood near the door, my back against the wall, watching the room implode under the weight of truth. The laughter had vanished, replaced by gasps, whispers, and the sharp clinking of glasses dropped in disbelief. The once celebratory music had cut off mid-note, and for a few seconds, all that could be heard was the echo of their voices on the screen, his and hers, those same soft tones that used to be mine. He lunged toward the control booth, shouting something I couldn't make out. His face was a mask of panic, eyes wide, mouth moving without sound as the microphone squealed. The projector operator froze, unsure who to obey. I could almost feel his pulse from across the room. The image behind him continued mercilessly. The hotel bed, the laughter, the careless intimacy of two people who believed themselves untouchable. Then came the murmurs. The crowd had turned into a sea of whispers, friends and colleagues exchanging glances, phones raised like silent judges. No one looked away now. The truth had its own gravity, pulling every eye toward the screen. She stood motionless in the center of it all, her birthday crown crooked, the color draining from her face. Her glass slipped from her hand, shattering against the marble floor. The sound snapped through the room like a gunshot. He reached her first, grabbing her by the wrist, muttering something desperate, but she pulled away as though his touch burned. I could see it even from where I stood, the realization dawning in her eyes, not that he'd been caught, but that he'd never truly been hers either. The betrayal looped, frame after frame, until there was nowhere for them to hide. I stepped forward then, slow, deliberate. The heels of my shoes echoed across the ballroom, cutting through the confusion. Heads turned, one by one, as if they'd felt me before they saw me. And then they did. Me, the wife, the ghost behind the curtain. My face calm, my shoulders square. Not vengeance, not chaos. Just a woman who had stopped apologizing for wanting the truth. When his eyes finally met mine, he froze. There was no anger left in me, no shouting left to do. He had already heard everything worth saying, played back in high definition for everyone to see. He tried to speak, but the words collapsed in his throat. "You shouldn't have," he began. I cut him off with a single sentence. "I shouldn't have believed you." That was all. No screaming, no scene. Just the end of a lie spoken softly enough for everyone to hear. I turned toward the operator, who stood frozen behind the console. "Turn it off," I said. My voice didn't waver. The screen went black, leaving only the sound of heavy breathing and distant music from another room. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, slowly, the crowd began to scatter, slipping away in awkward silence. The illusion had been peeled away too violently to pretend anymore. I could feel their eyes on me, a mixture of pity, shock, and something else. Admiration, maybe. But I didn't need it. He stood in the middle of the room, hands limp at his sides, staring at the empty screen. The woman beside him, his lover, his accomplice, whispered something to him through her tears. He didn't answer. When I passed by, I stopped just long enough to whisper one thing into his ear. "This is what truth looks like when you hide it too long." I walked out without looking back. The night air hit me like a baptism, sharp and cold, washing away everything that had clung to me for years. Doubt, fear, humiliation. I took a deep breath and looked up at the city lights, still flickering against the dark sky. Somewhere behind me, the music resumed, weak and offbeat, as if the party were trying to pretend it could continue. But everyone there knew it was already over. As I walked down the empty street, I replayed the moment when the first image appeared on screen. His face, her smile, the crowd gasping, and me standing in the shadows, watching justice unfold without a single drop of blood. For the first time in a long time, I felt powerful. Not because I had destroyed him, but because I had reclaimed myself. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't drink. I didn't collapse. I simply went home, opened the windows, and let the night air fill the silence he had left behind. The next morning arrived gray and heavy, as if the world itself were holding its breath. My phone buzzed relentlessly on the nightstand, a string of messages lighting up the screen. Friends, colleagues, numbers I didn't even recognize. Some sent sympathy, others curiosity. A few brutal honesty. "You were right to do it. He deserved it. Are you okay?" I didn't answer any of them. Words felt useless after so much noise. The city outside moved as if nothing had happened, but my house felt like a hollow shell. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was electric, alive with the echo of what I'd done. I made coffee just to feel something normal, but the smell of roasted beans brought me back to mornings when he used to kiss my neck while I poured his cup. I pushed the memory away like smoke. By noon, the story had spread. Someone had filmed the moment the screen switched. Shaky footage, but clear enough to go viral among the people who knew us. The headline wasn't written in newspapers, but in whispers. The wife who exposed her husband at the lovers' party. My humiliation had become legend. My pain, entertainment. But strangely, I didn't feel ashamed. For the first time, the shame wasn't mine to carry. He showed up around 3 in the afternoon. I heard the car door slam before I saw him. When I opened the door, his face looked older, his eyes bloodshot, his jaw tight with exhaustion and panic. "We need to talk," he said. His voice, once so sure, cracked like glass under pressure. I stepped aside. "You've had months to talk," I said. "Now you can listen." He walked in cautiously, as if the house itself might reject him. The silence between us was unbearable. Finally, he spoke. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You humiliated me, us, in front of everyone." I laughed softly, the kind of laugh that comes when pain turns into clarity. "Us?" I said. "There hasn't been an us for a long time." He rubbed his temples, his voice rising. "You could have ruined my career. You didn't have to do it like that." I leaned against the wall, arms crossed. You ruined your career the moment you unzipped that bag, I said. All I did was press play. He stared at me then, truly looked at me for the first time in years. I could see it in his eyes, the shock that I wasn't broken, that the woman who used to cry quietly had become something else. You think you're strong because of this? He asked bitterly. No, I said calmly. I'm strong because I survived you. For a moment, there was silence. He sank into a chair, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for it to go this far. That sentence hung in the air, pathetic and weightless. That's the thing about betrayal, I said. It always goes further than you think. It begins as a secret and ends as destruction. He buried his face in his hands. Maybe he cried. I don't know. I didn't care enough to look. I just watched the clock tick behind him, every second a reminder that I had already wasted too much of my life waiting for remorse. After a long while, he stood. I'll leave for a few days, he said quietly. Let things calm down, I nodded. Leave your keys. He froze. What? You heard me, I said. This house doesn't belong to lies anymore. He stared at me as if seeing a ghost. Then, without a word, he set the keys on the table and walked out. The door clicked softly behind him, the sound of a chapter closing. I stood there for a long time, staring at the keys. My hands shook, not from anger, but from release. I realized I wasn't mourning the end of love. I was mourning the years I'd spent convincing myself it was still alive. That night, I sat on the balcony with a glass of wine and watched the city lights flicker below. My phone still buzzed with messages, but I ignored them all. Somewhere out there, he was explaining, denying, spinning stories to save what little pride he had left. And somewhere else, she was hiding from the spotlight she had once craved. Me? I was finally still. Not victorious, not vengeful, just free. The air felt different that night, lighter, as if the weight I'd carried for years had finally dissolved. And as the clock struck midnight, I whispered into the quiet. I didn't destroy anything. I just stopped protecting what was already broken. He came back 2 nights later, not out of courage but out of habit. It was late, past midnight. The street wrapped in silence except for the hum of a single lamppost that cast a pool of light over the driveway. That light would become the stage for our last act. Not the shouting, not the begging, but the truth said out loud for the first time. I heard his car before I saw it, the engine cutting through the stillness like an unwanted memory. My heart didn't race this time. It was strange. The woman who once shook at his voice now felt nothing at all. When he knocked, I didn't rush. I opened the door slowly, meeting his eyes with the same calm that once used to disarm me when it came from him. He looked exhausted, not in the way people do after sleepless nights, but in the way liars do when they run out of lies. Can we talk? He asked. Talking seems to be your favorite form of damage control, I said, stepping aside. He hesitated before walking in, his gaze wandering around the living room as if he expected it to look different. You changed the curtains, he murmured. I changed everything that smelled like you, I replied. He didn't sit down. Instead, he stood near the window, the floodlight outside painting half his face in white, the other in shadow. It was fitting. I can't sleep, he admitted. Everywhere I go, people look at me like I'm poison, even at work. I tilted my head, my tone quiet but firm. And what do you expect me to say? That I'm sorry you got caught? He flinched. You humiliated me. I exposed you, I corrected. You did the humiliating yourself. He turned toward me, eyes full of a bitterness that no longer scared me. You think this makes you a hero? You think people respect you now? I don't care what people think, I said, stepping closer until my reflection filled his pupils. I care that I finally respect myself. For the first time, he looked away. The silence between us was sharp enough to cut. He ran a hand through his hair, voice trembling now. I made a mistake, okay? I didn't mean to fall for her. It just happened. The words hung in the air, pathetic and weightless. I let them sit there before answering. You didn't fall, you climbed. Every lie you told me was another rung. Every touch, every promise, every excuse. You built your way into that betrayal one decision at a time. He took a breath, as if searching for something to throw back. And what about you? You spied on me. You filmed me. I recorded the truth, I said flatly, because you'd already erased it. The wind outside picked up, rustling the trees. The floodlight flickered for a second, and in that flicker I saw the man he used to be. Younger, softer, the one who once knelt before me in a church and said he couldn't breathe without me. That ghost didn't live in him anymore. Maybe it never had. He sank into a chair finally, his hands gripping the sides as if the world were tilting. I don't know who I am anymore, he said. You're a man who got caught, I answered. Now you get to decide if that's who you'll stay. He looked up, eyes shining with a mixture of anger and something almost like regret. Do you hate me? I shook my head slowly. No. Hate takes energy. You don't deserve that kind of power anymore. He nodded, defeated. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I gestured toward the door. You should go. You've already taken enough from this house. He stood, walked past me, then stopped at the doorway. You'll regret this one day, he said softly. Being alone. I smiled faintly. I was alone long before you left. He didn't reply. The floodlight followed him down the driveway until his shadow disappeared into the night. I stood there watching the emptiness he left behind, realizing it wasn't painful anymore, just quiet. When I closed the door, the sound echoed through the house like closure. I locked it, turned off the lights, and stood in the darkness, breathing in the air that finally belonged only to me. That night, under the faint glow from the window, I realized something. The confrontation hadn't been for him. It had been for me. To hear my own voice again. To know it still existed, steady and sure, after years of being silenced. And as I lay down, the world outside calm once more, I whispered to myself, freedom doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just exhales. The morning after that last confrontation, sunlight poured through the curtains in thin golden stripes. I woke not to the sound of his car or his voice, but to birdsong and the distant hum of a garbage truck. The house felt different, hollow but clean, like an old wound finally drained. My first instinct was to listen for his footsteps, and when they didn't come, a strange quiet spread through me. Freedom isn't always fireworks. Sometimes it's just the absence of footsteps you no longer need to fear. By mid-morning, the doorbell rang. Mrs. Delgado stood there, her robe pulled tight, a mug of coffee in her hand. She didn't need to say why she'd come. She had seen the footage. Half the neighborhood had. I'm so sorry, she murmured, her eyes brimming. I wish I'd said something sooner. I invited her in, and she sat at my kitchen table, tracing circles on the mug. We all suspected, she admitted. But you seemed so sure, so loyal. And he always waved, always smiled. You know how people are. They'd rather watch a house burn quietly than knock on the door. Her honesty stung, but it was a clean sting, like antiseptic. Later, at the grocery store, whispers followed me down every aisle. Some people looked away when our eyes met. Others stared too long, as if trying to measure the kind of woman who would expose a husband like that. A younger woman stopped me near the dairy section, her voice low. I saw what you did, she said. It was brave. I wish my mother had done the same. Her hands trembled as she picked up a carton of milk. Then she walked away before I could answer. Not all the reactions were kind. An older man from the neighborhood muttered as I passed, "Air your dirty laundry in public and you'll never wash it clean." His wife tugged at his sleeve, shushing him, but I heard it anyway. For a second, shame rose like a tide. Then I remembered his words weren't mine to carry. I kept walking, my head high. At the post office, a stranger I'd never met before touched my arm lightly. "You don't know me," she said softly, "but you gave me courage. I've been living with a liar for 10 years. Watching you was like seeing someone open a window in a locked room." She smiled through tears. "Thank you." It struck me then that what had felt like an explosion in my life had rippled outward in ways I hadn't imagined. Some saw scandal. Others saw survival. A few saw themselves. The gossip was a mirror reflecting whatever people feared or hoped for in their own lives. That evening, As the sun dipped low and painted the street in copper light, I sat on the porch for the first time in months. Children played down the block, their laughter rising and falling like a tide. Mrs. Delgado waved from her window. A delivery boy slowed his bike to nod at me. Small gestures, but each one stitching a tiny thread back into the fabric of my world. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. The walls were still bare where his pictures had hung, but they no longer felt like wounds. They felt like canvases waiting for something new. I realized I didn't need everyone's approval. I didn't even need their sympathy. I had walked through humiliation and come out whole. That was enough. Later that night, I went through the messages on my phone. Some I deleted. Some I saved. One from my daughter's old friend simply read, "I never thought you'd stand up like that. I'm proud of you." Reading it, I felt a small surge of warmth. Pride is a strange thing. It doesn't roar. It settles quietly into your bones until you realize you've stopped apologizing for surviving. I sat back and exhaled. Outside, a neighbor's wind chime rang in the breeze. It didn't sound like gossip. It sounded like permission to begin again. The days that followed unfolded slowly, like the quiet after a storm when the world still smells of rain and ash. The noise faded, the gossip, the calls, the curious messages from people who suddenly remembered my name. I no longer cared what anyone said. The truth had already been shown, burned into screens, whispered across dinner tables, etched into their memory. My life was no longer a rumor. It was evidence. But evidence has a cost. The price of proof isn't paid in money. It's paid in silence. Nights felt longer now. Without him, the house seemed too still, too symmetrical. I would catch myself setting 2 plates for dinner or reaching for his jacket when it rained. Habits take longer to leave than people do. But each time I stopped myself, it hurt a little less. Some mornings I'd wake and feel the urge to check the footage again, as if to remind myself that it had really happened. Then I'd close the laptop and whisper, "You don't need proof anymore." I wasn't chasing answers. I had found them, and they had cost me enough. The lawyer finalized the separation quickly. He didn't fight much. Maybe because he knew fighting meant more exposure, more eyes on the truth. He gave me the house without protest, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of exhaustion. When the final papers arrived, I held them for a long time before signing. My hand didn't shake. I signed not just to end a marriage, but to end a version of myself that had lived too long in fear. I learned strange things about grief in those weeks. It doesn't only come when someone dies. It comes when someone stays alive in a body you no longer recognize. I grieved the man who once made me laugh until I cried. I grieved the woman who believed his promises. But grief, I realized, is not a sign of weakness. It's proof that you still have a heart, even after someone tried to break it. One evening I took the camera, the same one that had revealed everything, and placed it on the kitchen counter. I stared at it for a while, remembering the shaking hands that had sewn it into the lining of his bag, the sleepless nights waiting for the signal to connect. That small device had destroyed a lie, but it had also carried a piece of my soul. I opened the back door and threw it into the trash bin. The sound it made hitting the bottom was softer than I expected. A small metallic goodbye. The air outside smelled of jasmine again. Mrs. Delgado's garden was in bloom. I stood there barefoot, feeling the ground under my feet. The solid, unshakable ground of a life reclaimed. For years I had been floating in someone else's story, waiting for them to write me a happy ending. Now I understood that endings aren't gifts. They're choices. Sometimes, when I walk past the mirror in the hallway, I stop and look at myself longer than before. My reflection no longer looks tired. My eyes, once full of questions, now hold something steadier. Not anger, not triumph, but peace. People still talk occasionally. They'll say, "That's the woman who exposed her husband." They don't know the whole story, but they never will. Let them talk. The truth isn't mine to defend anymore. It did its job. I still think about him sometimes. Not with love, not with hate, but with a kind of detached compassion. He will carry the weight of his choices in rooms I'll never enter again. And me? I carry nothing but air and the soft hum of a life that finally belongs to me. On my last night before leaving for a trip of my own, not to escape, but to begin, I stood by the window, watching the lights of the city blur into stars. I thought of that party, of the faces frozen in shock, of the woman in the red dress whose birthday became my rebirth. I whispered a quiet prayer, not for revenge, not for justice, but for release. Then I turned off the lights, locked the door, and smiled. The proof had cost me everything, but peace was finally mine.